A coincidence is defined as a remarkable concurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. The world seems to be full of them, from the mundane to the truly astonishing. Some can even leave us pondering if we truly are the ones in control of our destiny, or if someone or something else is pulling the strings. These are stories of some of the world's most amazing coincidences. Roy Sullivan was a United States Park Ranger in Virginia, and between the years of 1942 and 1977, he was struck by lightning a total of 7 times. The chance of this happening to someone is 4.15 in 100 quintillion. He was struck while in the national forest that he worked in several times, once in his vehicle, and even one time in the garden of his home. On at least 2 of the occasions, Mr. Sullivan reported that the storm clouds appeared to be following him, and when he would try to outrun them, he would still ultimately end up being struck. After being struck the 4th time, Mr. Sullivan became convinced that the lightning was somehow attracted to him. He began to carry around a bottle of water with him because of the numerous times that the strikes had set his hair on fire. The Guinness Book of World Records acknowledges Mr. Sullivan as the person struck by lightning more times than anyone else on Earth. Walter Summerford was an officer in the British Army during World War I when he was first struck by lightning. He was riding on his horse and was struck seemingly out of nowhere. After the strike threw him off of the terrified animal, Mr. Summerford was left paralyzed from his hips down and was confined to a wheelchair. Then, in 1924, Mr. Summerford was struck again, this time in Canada while fishing. Lightning struck a tree, and the current traveled to Mr. Summerford's body, which absorbed it. Strangely enough, 2 days after his second lightning strike, Mr. Summerford's paralysis was gone, and he was able to use his legs again. After regaining the use of his legs, the man began doing a lot of outdoor activities, including hiking in local parks. One sunny day in 1930, Mr. Summerford was walking in a nearby area when the weather suddenly turned dark and stormy. He heard the crack of thunder and immediately tried to run for cover. Sadly, he was struck by lightning for the 3rd time before he could find a safe place to ride out the storm. This strike left his entire body paralyzed. After this strike, Mr. Summerford was in very bad health and seemed to be fighting just to stay alive. He passed away 2 years after the 3rd lightning strike. 4 years after Mr. Summerford was buried, his tombstone was struck by lightning. Were these 2 gentlemen simply unlucky, or was there something in their bodies which somehow attracted lightning to them? Or perhaps, like some have suggested, they were cursed. It appears that we will simply never know. Edgar Allan Poe's book, titled The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, was published in 1838. The story was about a man named Pym who is stowed away on a whaling ship. When things began to go bad, the crew rebelled, leaving almost everyone on the ship dead. To make matters worse, a storm came and wrecked the boat, leaving the 4 remaining crew members adrift. Hungry and dying of thirst, the desperate crew catches and eats a sea turtle, but it is not enough food for all of them. They decide that one of the 4 remaining crew members will have to be killed and eaten, or else all 4 of the men will die of starvation. They draw straws to see who will be the one to die, and a young man named Richard Parker is the unlucky one chosen. He is eaten, and the crew is eventually rescued. In 1884, the grisly story would appear to come to fruition when a ship called the Mignonette was hit by storms off the coast of Africa. The boat was destroyed, and the crew was left adrift in the open ocean with no food or water. Just as in the story, the crew caught a turtle and ate it, but it wasn't nearly filling enough for the starving men. They decided that someone must be killed and eaten, or none of them would survive. The youngest crew member was chosen. His name was Richard Parker, the same name given to the young man in Poe's novel years earlier. Just as in the book, only a few days after eating the boy, the crew was rescued. In 1848, 14 years before the Titanic sank, Morgan Roberts wrote a novella called Futility. In the story, he writes of a ship called the Titan that, like the Titanic, was described as unsinkable, and that also had an insufficient amount of lifeboats on board. He described the Titan as the largest craft afloat and the greatest of the works of man, a description that could have just as easily been applied to the Titanic. In the novella, the Titan would meet its end by crashing into an iceberg in the North Atlantic, a fate that would also meet the Titanic 14 years later. Popular Mechanics published a short story about an 800-foot luxury ship that hit an iceberg while traveling across the Atlantic at 22.5 knots. In the story, many people on board the ship passed away because of a lack of lifeboats on the huge ship. What was published right next to the short story in the magazine? News of the Titanic sinking, an 882-foot luxury ship that was traveling at 22.5 knots and sank because it hit an iceberg, killing many people because of a lack of lifeboats. Were the authors of these stories somehow able to subconsciously see into the future and bring their visions to life in their books? Or was it all somehow a strange and very specific coincidence? On July 30th, 1974, a 17-year-old boy named Neville Evan was riding his moped down the road in Hamilton, Bermuda, when he was run over by a taxi. Sadly, the boy passed away from his injuries that he sustained in the accident. Only a little less than 12 months later, on July 18, 1975, the deceased boy's brother Erskine, also 17 at the time, was involved in an accident on the same moped and also passed away. Strangely enough, he was hit by the same taxi with the same man driving that hit his brother. Even more unbelievable, the taxi driver was also carrying the exact same passenger that he was carrying when Neville was killed almost 1 year before. Actor James Dean purchased his allegedly cursed Porsche Spyder 550 on September 21, 1955. By September 30th of the same year, he was killed after the Porsche collided with another vehicle in Chalami, California. His passenger, German Porsche mechanic Rolf Wutheridge, was injured in the crash, but ultimately survived. Roughly 7 days before his death, Dean met with British actor Alec Guinness in Los Angeles for lunch. Upon seeing the vehicle, Mr. Guinness warned Dean that if he got inside that car, he would be found dead in it by the next week. Dean was said to have laughed off the unusual comment. Strangely enough, he was killed in the vehicle within 7 days. The Porsche Spyder was totaled by the insurance company. However, George Barris, who helped Dean customize the car, purchased the mangled vehicle anyway. When it was delivered to Barris's auto shop, it slipped off the trailer that it was brought in on and broke both legs of one of the mechanics who was attempting to help unload it. Mr. Barris would go on to sell different parts of the car to different individuals, selling the engine to Dr. Troy McHenry and the transaxle to Dr. William Eschrich. Both doctors had their own racing vehicles and used the parts that they purchased from Barris in their own cars. 13 months after Dean's death, the doctors entered their vehicles in a race. During the race, Dr. McHenry hit a tree and was killed, and Dr. Eschrich's car locked up and rolled several times. He was injured but survived. In 1960, the seemingly cursed vehicle was on a sealed train trailer going from Miami, Florida to Los Angeles, California, when it somehow disappeared from the trailer. Rolf Wutherish, the Porsche mechanic who was in the car when James Dean wrecked, was said to have lived a very tragic life after the accident. He attempted suicide twice in the 1960s, and in 1967 he stabbed his wife 14 times with a kitchen knife in a failed murder-suicide attempt. Then, in 1981, Mr. Wutherish died in a drunk driving accident. The cursed Porsche is still missing to this day. Was it possible that James Dean's beloved car was cursed from the beginning, somehow bringing death and despair to almost all who had any dealings with it? Could all of these events truly just be bizarre occurrences with no rhyme or reason? Or is there something more at play? Something unexplainable? Perhaps we will never know. Thank you for watching Twisted Willow Pictures. Until next time, sweet dreams.